How have you made a rude person's day worse? Story 1. Every year, my dad would wrap a month's worth of trash as gifts. He made them look nice and professional. He would drive to the bad section of town where the major mall was, with all the presents in the bed of his truck. He would go grab a coffee at the shop across the street and wait for the hoodlums to steal the Christmas gifts. Story 2. Just the other day, I was at a Chinese buffet, and the 3 people in the booth next to me were questioning the waitress, who appeared to be Asian Hispanic, about voting for the president and who she planned to vote for. She had trouble understanding them and communicating that she could not vote. They immediately began taunting her, saying that she shouldn't be here if she couldn't vote, and that she didn't even know who the president of the United States is, and then took a picture and said they would post it on Facebook. I later found out the waitress was on a school visa and couldn't vote, but I was unable to convey that to them. After the waitress walked off, one of the girls at the table, the one who took the picture, looked up and asked me where I worked because I looked familiar. When I replied, the local university in a social work department. She commented that she had recently been in my office to apply to our program, to which I replied, yes, I remember you, and I'm also on the admissions committee, followed with a wink. The color drained from her face, and she knew she was screwed. Karma's a pain. Story 3. I work at a retail location that only does returns with tags on the clothes. There was one customer who was exceptionally rude to our staff. She called both women dumb witches, which pissed me off. She came up to the register, telling me she'll probably return all the things she's buying and is just trying to impress her friends. So I took all the tags off the clothes when I was bagging everything. I made the world a better place that day. Story 4. Today on the train, I sat next to a woman who was angry that I sat next to her because she wanted the 2 seats to herself. As I sat there, she kept mouthing off under her breath about how she just wanted to sit there alone. Despite the fact that I wanted to tell her it was public transportation and she needed to get over it, I kept my mouth shut. A few minutes later, a large woman with a big purse came and stood in the same train car as me. I got her attention and told her she could have my seat. She huffed and puffed her way to me, and I helped her sit down while grinning at the angry woman who was upset I had sat beside her. I enjoyed watching her head almost explode from anger as the other woman's rolls and purse pressed against her for the rest of the ride. Story 5. I work in a local theater, and we have a lot of rude, awful women who are part of local ballet schools come through our venue and are the mothers of the dancers. Once, this woman rang up wanting seats to an almost sold-out ballet performance that had been on sale for 4 months the day before the show, and did nothing but me for 5 minutes because she left buying them too late. She whined about how she shouldn't have to pay for her kids, whined that we should get a bigger venue, it seats just under 500, then put me on hold while she rang 3 of her relatives to see if they wanted seats too. She was positively awful. The seats I was about to sell her were the only ones in the theater left, and they were good seats. While I was on hold, the grandma of the ballerinas came to the desk and asked if we had any seats left, as she'd been in the hospital and couldn't buy them earlier, but said she'd understand if we were booked out. I put the phone with the on-hold music down and sold this old lady the last seats for the show and gave her an invite to our next year's dance season for her granddaughter and herself, so she'd know exactly when all the important dates were coming. She thanked me over and over, and she's now one of our regulars and brings her grandkids to our shows. 2 minutes after the old lady left, the woman on the other end finally took me off hold and said she wanted the remaining seats that we had left. I told her, sorry, we've just sold out while you had me on hold, I'm afraid. Better luck next year. Anything else I can help you with? She was choking with rage on the other end of the phone. It was fantastic. Story 6. I watched a lazy shopper park their grocery cart right behind another person's car instead of putting it in the cart return. I got out of my car, ran up, moved the cart, and put it behind the cart return. Then I ran off and watched her have to get back out of her car since she couldn't back out, and finally proceeded to put her cart the right way. I felt like a champion of the people. Story 7. I saw a woman and her husband toss a squash into a cooler that they apparently didn't want anymore. As they walked away, I picked up the squash and followed them. They left their cart for a moment, so I put the squash into their cart and walked away. She had a dumbfounded look on her face when she noticed it back in her cart. I put it in a very noticeable place and proceeded to put it on a nearby shelf, and they walked away. Of course, I took it off the shelf and followed them again, doing a drive-by drop-off of the squash. At this moment, my girlfriend got fed up with my antics and made me stop. I would have done it until they gave up and bought the squash or I was caught. I'm very easily amused. Story 8. I was working as a manager in a big nightclub about a year ago. I don't wear a uniform but have a radio and run the security team. The venue has a great smoking section that looks out onto the street. One night, the venue was packed, so I did my usual roam, making sure that there were no problems. However, it was too packed to walk through the smoking section, so I walked down the street instead, but I could still very easily see into the smoking section. One guy stared me down, then called me over and started swearing at me for no reason, telling me that pieces of waste like you could never even get into a venue like this. He obviously had no idea I was the manager. However, I didn't want to have security get into a fight inside with him. The guy kept telling me he would punch me out, etc. I was clearly trying to look macho to impress someone, so I agreed and told him to come and meet me outside, and he could even have a free swing. He put his drink down, took off his jacket, and stormed outside. Once he walked outside, I walked back inside and told security not to let him back in. The look on his face when he realized I ran the place was priceless. Then the realization that he couldn't get back into the club was amazing. It was the easiest and most fun removal I've ever done. Story 9. I heard this from a DJ in my hometown. He was pushing his cart of groceries out of the store and over to his car when a woman pulled into the handicapped spot in front of the store. There were no placards or handicap plates on her car, and she jumped out of the car without so much as a limp and headed into the store. He gave her the stink eye about taking up a handicapped spot, and she snarled, "Deal with it," and sashayed into the store. The guy was pissed. He saw a couple of cops who were leaning against their cars talking. They hadn't seen it, so he went over and told them the story. They smiled and said they'd handle it. He puts his groceries in his car, and as he was pushing his cart back to the store to put it in the rack, good guy DJ, he saw the cops had blocked the lady's car with theirs and were leaning against their car waiting for her. As he was putting his cart in the rack, the lady came out of the store with her purchase, saw the cops, and almost pooped. The fine in California is $250 to $500 for a first offense. Priceless. He walked over to her and said, "I dealt with it." Story 10. I was in a theater quite a few years ago. Some action flick, I think Jean-Claude Van Damme. And there were two 16-year-olds or so kids in front of me who were, in turn, behind a group of smaller kids, say 12 or so. I was alone. The wife hates action movies. I quickly noticed that the two older kids were freaking out with the younger ones, kicking their seat backs, throwing popcorn at them, flicking spit at them, the works. The theater was crowded so the little guys couldn't move. Finally, one of the dudes leaned forward and, I think, flicked one kid's ear. When the little kid turned around to glare, the flicking teen said, "You got a problem with that, poop face?" His friend guffawed. When the Flickmeister sat back, I hauled off and gave him a decent slap upside the head, knocking his noggin into his friends. They both turned and half jumped out of their seats, then paused when they saw me. I am 6'2", 225 pounds. I stood up and said, "You got a problem with that, poop face?" They looked at each other and then turned to sit back down. "Uh-huh," I said. "You sit there, and I'm going to make you as miserable as you've been making those guys in front of you." They shuffled out of the theater. The younger kids all turned and said, "Thank you, sir." Story 11. That takes me back. Years ago, I was in a cinema with some friends watching a horror film. I can't remember which one. Anyway, a couple of poop faces behind us thought it was really funny to yell boo in the tense parts and generally ruin the movie for everyone around them. I had a large, and by large, I mean a bucket of Coke. The next time poop face one yelled boo, I threw up my hands in shock and dumped the whole bucket of Coke in his lap. I turned around to apologize and saw him sitting there stunned and soaked, Coke dripping off the brim of his cap. I nearly gave myself a hernia trying not to laugh. I swear he made squelching noises as he walked out. Story 12. Female Redditor. I was out at the local watering hole having a few beers with a group of friends, and the group became larger and larger with time. After a while, I got semi-separated from my fiancé. I was introduced to a guy whom we'll call Bob. The introduction went like this. "Bob, this is psychocentric. Psychocentric, Bob." To which he said, "Every psychocentric I've ever met is a and a freaking whore." Now, I don't get bent out of shape without good reason, so I just brushed it off as drunk banter or maybe a recent breakup with a psychocentric and said, "Well, I'm neither, but nice to meet you anyway, Bob," and shook his hand. The rest of the night, he would go to the bar, walk back, and give me the stink eye. For whatever reason, he didn't like me. The feeling was becoming mutual. I decided that ignoring him would probably be best. It was certainly not in the right mindset, right? A few hours passed, and I was sitting by his female friend, having fun, talking and giggling. He put his elbows on the table in between us, staring at me like I had done him wrong somehow. They kept on with their conversation and ignored him. He then put his nasty face right next to mine and said, "So, are you a My temper and alcohol got the best of me, and I yelled, "No, and what the hell is your problem exactly? I've been doing my best to ignore you. Get a clue." He then chest bumped me and said, "Do you want to go?" I'm all for equal rights, but this was the first time an able-bodied adult male has asked me, a girl, if I wanted to throw down. I walked over a few steps to my fiancé, who was talking to a bouncer friend of ours, and said, "This guy says he wants to kick my ass." Well, the dude just kept advancing. The bouncer looked at him, gave a hand signal, and soon 5 red shirts, bouncer uniforms, surrounded him. He was escorted out of the bar and went to his minivan, drunk. I called work. I work for the sheriff's department. They got a good tip on a sure thing, DUI. I might not have thrown down, but I think I won that round. Story 13. I used to work for the Department of Motor Vehicles, or DMV, and the one I worked at had limited parking. One day I went out for lunch, and upon returning, I struggled to find a spot. Eventually I found one and put my signal on to indicate that I was waiting for it. However, just as the car was backing out, a woman drove from the opposite side of the lot, made eye contact with me, and took the spot. I was frustrated, because I would be late now. As I drove past her, she shrugged her shoulders, smiled, and mocked me by mouthing the words, "Oh well," and running her finger from her eye down her cheek as if I were crying about it. I forgot about the incident until the woman's number was called to my station while I was working. The look on her face was priceless. As a DMV worker, I understood that things happen and waive penalties all the time. I always treated my customers with respect, because I believe that what goes around comes around. So I greeted the spot stealer as nicely as I would anyone else, maybe even nicer than usual. She may have thought I didn't recognize her. However, her registration was far past due, with hundreds of dollars due in penalties. She tried to tell me her sob story, but I reminded her that she was aware of her due date and had to pay in full. She argued a little until, out of sight of my manager, I mouthed the words, "Oh well," and dragged my finger from my eye to my cheek, mocking her tears. At that point, she put her head down and paid the full amount using her debit card. What goes around, comes around. Story 14. I used to work as a waitress in an Italian restaurant that was originally opened by a couple, but after their divorce, their daughter took over the business. She was an okay boss, not fantastic, but not terrible. However, her father, who was also a cook at the restaurant, was a piece of work. He would call the waitresses bad names behind their backs, make off-color comments while flirting with his favorite old ladies, scream at younger women, bully the cooks on the line. There was even a story about a mishap with some fryer oil and a fry cook a few years back. Since I was usually on top of my game, he didn't give me a lot of trouble. I had the timing down for how long most of the food took and adjusted for the load of the kitchen, so I was always present in the window when the food was ready to go out. I always heard his snide little comments and muttered some of my own at him a few times, but I always waited for the perfect time to get him for being such an insufferable prick. Finally, I got my chance. I had 2 plates up in the window when I walked into the kitchen. I was waiting on a 3rd plate and a side of meatballs. He accosted me as soon as I walked up there and said something like, "Why don't you get this food out of my window?" I calmly looked at him and replied, "The next time you say something like that to me, this food is not going out. This food is going on the floor." This guy was easily 6 feet tall, while I'm only 5 feet 1 inch. He just smirked and said, "I'd like to see you try that." I picked up 1 plate of spaghetti and meat sauce, which probably takes less than a minute to plate anyway, and just flipped it over the window. And I need my order of lasagna and the side of meatballs too. The expo guy had a look of admiration on his face and was shocked at what I had done. He didn't even seem annoyed at having to replate the meal. I'm not sure though. I was blind with rage and marched out of the kitchen and onto the floor. We weren't that busy, so I think they had a busboy clean it up. I wasn't spoken to about the incident except in passing, when the daughter admitted her dad could get a little intense, and her sister, who also worked there, explained that her sister often got into it with her father, and it wasn't that big of a deal. He was always polite to me after that and never hassled me again. I nearly pooped myself when I realized what I had done though. Story 15. I went to get my exhaust fixed because a pothole poked a hole in it. I was treated to a woman screaming at the guy behind the counter. She was positively foaming because she had been waiting nearly 30 minutes for her car to be fixed. She even went so far as to call the guy an insidious, lazy immigrant. The guy looked at her, looked at me, threw me my keys, and said, "Here you go, your Magnum's ready, no charge." He then looked at her directly in the eyes and said, "Looks like it's going to be more expensive than we originally thought. Would you like us to call you a cab?" I returned shortly afterwards with pizza for the shop. Story 16. This guy walked up to my work and asked, "Hey kid, where the hell is Voodoo Donuts?" He swore in front of a child nearby and was loudly smacking his gum. Instead of sending him to Voodoo Donuts, which was only a few blocks away, I gave him directions that would lead him under the Burnside Bridge, where the homeless, the prostitutes, and the drug congregated. Story 17. A trashy, Jerry Springer-looking young lady at Toys R Us on Black Friday tried to cut in the massive 90-minute line and threw a fit when she was told to go to the end of the line. She yelled at the employees and threw her products into the faces of the security guards as she was told to leave. I started a slow clap, to which she replied, shrieking, "Screw y'all!" Story 18. My husband and I were driving home from my in-laws' house, which was just over an hour away, and for reasons I can't remember, we were in separate vehicles. To make the trip more tolerable, we had each other on speakerphone. Although the highway was not particularly crowded, he was a bit further behind me, directly behind another car that was driving very slowly. So he put on his left blinker to go around the guy. As soon as he started to move left, the guy abruptly cut him off, only to keep up a snail's pace in the passing lane. By that point, I had slowed down enough to catch sight of them right as this was happening. Jay, being much more patient than I, decided to just pass him on the right without signaling. When Jay started to move right, the guy swerved right. Only Jay hadn't given him the benefit of a blinker warning. So they were nearly side by side by the time the other guy started to move right, and he had to swerve back into his own lane to avoid hitting Jay. Before the other driver had time to make it more of a nonsense pissing match of trying to get in front of one another, I slowed down right in front of him. Again, there weren't really many other cars on the road at all, and since we were on the phone, we could coordinate. I slowed down in front of him, Jay kept pace with him on the right, and he had the cement wall on his left, so he was boxed in and forced to slow down to our pace, which for me dropped from 75 miles per hour to about 50 miles per hour. We decided to keep it that way for the remaining 30 to 45 minutes of our drive home. He never signaled or honked, but he did make a ton of confused and frustrated faces. I giggled uncontrollably the whole way. It was definitely worth the extended driving time. Story 19. I used to work for a major bank, and while doing my stint there, I came across a ton of freaks. I was taking a deposit for a lady and her daughter, and I heard them speaking a Middle Eastern language. At first, I wasn't paying attention, but when I realized they were speaking Farsi, I was all ears. The reason being that I speak Farsi. They were talking about how much of a loser I was, how this job as a teller was the only thing I had in my life, that I probably didn't have a girlfriend, that I didn't attend school. Throughout this conversation, I spoke only English to her, and every time she responded to my requests, she would smile and then say something nasty about me in Farsi. At the end of the conversation, I switched up the language and said, "Just because I work at a bank doesn't give you the right to say things about me behind my back. I'm in graduate school to become a psychotherapist. This job is for spending money. This isn't how Persian people behave, and you should be ashamed. Is there anything else I can help you with?" Her daughter snapped and left the building, and her mother was beet red, embarrassed, apologized profusely, and left. I never saw either of them again. Story 20. When people are rude to me at my fast food job, I practically overflow their cup with ice. I'm a little passive-aggressive.